Years ago, the Gulf of Maine was teeming with fish. The waters were plentiful, right temperature, food, etc. Even in the early 1970s, people caught the huge ground fish like cod. Today, the picture is dire. After decades of destructive gear use by large commercial fleets, cod and other popular species stocks collapsed. New England generational fishermen have lost their livelihoods. After several generations that worked on the boats, the New England fishermen are abandoning the trade. The young are giving up the family traditions, looking for other ways to make a living. Their fathers' and grandfathers' boats are for sale, defunct, or abandoned. The way things are now, the big guys own and control everything, from per pound prices to the very access to fish. The family fishermen have so little control over fishing, when, what, and how much they can catch, and for how much they can sell it, that they can no longer stay in business.
Full-time fishermen? I would say full-time fishermen, 22 to 25. And then you had the winter guys, the guys doing lobster and then fishing, which would have put the number closer to like 40. Now there's none. They tied up. They might go part-time. There's like five boats less, including me, and we're all part-time.
So our sector, again, which is a cooperative group of fishermen fishing together, used to be 3 years ago, over 26 fishermen. Last year, approximately 18, and this year we're down to 9.
I mean, the only issue, well, not the only issue, a variety of issues is that, I used to be on the Fishery Management Council that created, the rules and the regulations and just kept track of a lot of the management issues. And I just read the tea leaves to say it doesn't look like this thing isn't gonna end. It's just gonna escalate.
I started fishing when I was about 15 years old out of Chatham. My brother was fishing out of here, so I'd trek down here after school and go fishing with him, and I fell in love with it. I continued doing that throughout high school. When I got out of high school, I joined the Army and I went away for 7 years. And all I could think about was coming back. And in '97, when I got back, I jumped right back on the boat. And I never looked back, so I've been full-time fishing since '97. It was great. Back when I got back from the military, it was phenomenal. Deckhands were doing great, captains were doing great, we were all doing good. And then management stepped in and started implementing rules and regulations that made no sense.
The current regulations favor large-scale industrial fleets, not only by making the business more competitive, but by restricting the family fishermen access to fish. What's going on is an ocean grab, a process similar to land grabbing. The big boat owners are divvying up the access to fish, essentially privatizing a public resource. It's done through a recent wave of regulations that treat fish as a commodity, access to which can be granted through catch quotas, which can be bought, sold, leased, and traded, just like financial instruments, accumulating in the hands of the players with the deepest pockets and the strongest lobbying power, and no connection or thought to the environmental consequences of fishing practices.
An important question is, how did this happen? How did this public resource be turned into something that's now being used as a private property, bought, sold, and traded at the expense of our food system, our family fishermen, our local coastal economies? How did this happen?
To answer that question, one has to trace the fishing history back to the times when it first became an industrial endeavor. The post-World War II tech boom equipped commercial fishermen with robust engines, larger nets, and better communication equipment. New long-distance fishing and processing vessels stayed at sea for months at a time, with no concerns that the fish they were taking may one day disappear.
After World War II, where the real industrialization took place, we began to see frigates, war frigates, being decommissioned and turned into factory whaling boats and factory fishing boats. So a lot of those boats were not mothballed. They were actually put into the fishing industry. And that essentially escalated the problem dramatically in ecosystems like here in the Gulf of Maine and in the Northwest Atlantic region. The industrial factory trawlers from Poland, from China, from Germany, from all these countries that had decommissioned warships began to fish at scales this environment had never experienced before. Months at a time at sea, taking out hundreds of thousands of metric tons. We think we have inexhaustible resources in our world. I think as humans, we look at everything as if it has a bottomless pit. Whether it's the land, we're going to industrial farm it to death. Whether it's the bison, we're going to kill them all. Whether it's the gold in the ground, or the coal in the ground, or the oil in the ground, or the fish under the waters, we have a tendency to assume infinity.
Before the 1970s, the ocean was thought of as an inexhaustible resource. As historian Mansell Blackford wrote, popular movies such as the 1954 production of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Beneath the Sea featured divers harvesting seemingly inexhaustible riches from the seas and oceans. There was great optimism that offshore fishing would provide the peoples of the world with much needed protein at reasonable costs. Consequentially, between 1970 and 1995, the number of fishing vessels worldwide increased from 451,000 to 885,000, and their aggregate size increased fivefold. The ships used a broad array of sophisticated technological devices, such as radar, sonar, LORAN, and global positioning systems to find fish. They then caught fish with lines up to 62 miles in length, strung with tens of thousands of hooks. They dragged huge trawl nets across the ocean bottom, often clear-cutting the ocean floor in the process. By the 1990s, a single trawl net could be large enough to hold a fleet of 12 Boeing 747 jumbo jets. And they deployed gigantic purse seine nets made of light but strong synthetic fibers. As biologist and conservationist Callum Roberts wrote in his book, The Unnatural History of the Sea, the 20th century heralded an escalation in fishing intensity that is unprecedented in the history of the oceans, and modern fishing technologies leave fish no place to hide.
There was a tremendous amount of overexploitation that happened, and that overexploitation has had a lingering effect here in the Gulf of Maine and many other places in the US. And as a result, in part, we have an ecology that no longer looks like the sort of natural ecology that was dominated by cod and other ground fish.
This phenomenon is what was called the tragedy of the commons. In the commonly used oceanic resources, there's little motivation for conservation. If one fisherman refrains from amassing as much catch as possible, his neighbor might as well take those fish, even if doing so means that a fish stock might be drastically reduced in size.
The tragedy of the commons is a concept that is widely used in fisheries management and in lots of cases in natural resource management. And it's this concept that in an open access environment, people have a tendency to attempt to increase their benefits for themselves. And this often leads to the erosion of the natural resource, whether that's some sort of agricultural setting or, in our case, fisheries.
I think at that moment we should have said, let's just stop, because the ecosystem was in trouble. This was in the 60s and 70s. Yet, what we did, which we do really well, it seems like, we kick out others and we escalate ourselves to meet that demand or that same level of fishing. So the US government in 1976 passed the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act.
The Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management Act is like the kind of Bible for the fisheries, the Farm Bill version for the fisheries. It governs all of the rules and regulations and policies. It was started in 1976. It established 8 regional fisheries councils around the United States, tasked to manage fisheries based on those regional ecosystems.
The Magnuson-Stevens Act was passed to regulate who can fish for what, where, when, and how much. It drew a 200-mile offshore line where foreign ships could fish no more. It laid out certain catch limits for domestic fishermen, such as to how many days they could spend at sea, how many pounds they could land, and what equipment they could use. As time progressed, the regulations were periodically updated with the hope of managing the resources better.
Starting in the 1970s, there's been an increasing amount of regulation put in place to try to constrain this tragedy of the commons. The big challenge now is, are those regulations actually doing that?
Or are these regulations now an impediment for family fishermen? and are driving them out of business.
Regulating us is a huge industry. It's a government industry, it's an environmental industry, and a lot of people are making money watching us, making sure we're not overfishing. And like, overfishing is a bad thing. The industry of regulating us and protecting the fish is much bigger than we are. I mean, there's more people, there's more money generated regulating fishing than there is actually money generated from us providing fish to them. So it's a big up. And the environmental groups are right partners, and they're playing hand in hand. We work together to regulate us and collect money, and they're shameless. I think they are. I've been doing this a long time, and I really care about the industry of fishing, and that's why I've spent literally probably thousands of hours of my free time going to meetings.
Here in New England, one of our staple fisheries that has provided for the livelihoods and been a big part of our culture for a long time is the groundfish fishery. The groundfish is a subset of 16 different species that swim along the bottom. Cod is included, flounder, pollock, haddock, a lot of fish that are swimming off of our shores are in that category of the groundfish. Now, management around the groundfish started in the 70s, and over time the strategies to manage sustainable stocks of those fish have changed. In the 90s, the strategy was to regulate the amount of days that a certain boat could go out. In addition, they would regulate the type of gear that you could use, and they would regulate the areas to make sure the boats were staying away from the spawning and juvenile fish. Then we had a big transition in our management, moving away from that days at sea strategy towards what's called a catch share program. That started in 2010.
From the Magnuson-Stevens website, it says this: under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, U.S. fisheries management is a transparent and robust process of science, management, innovation, and collaboration with the fishing industry. A scientific analysis of the abundance and composition of a fish stock evaluates the stock to determine if the stock status is subject to overfishing or overfished. Using this scientific data, councils set annual catch limits, and if they are exceeded in a fishing year, accountability measures predetermine the mechanism to respond. Since 2011, our domestic fisheries have had measures in place to meet the new requirements, and today, nearly 90% of fisheries are maintaining harvest levels below their annual catch limits. In theory, that sounds really good.
The theory behind a catch share program is that you calculate, this is based on science, calculate the total populations of all of those groundfish species. So you have a total population. You cap that. And you say, as long as the entire fleet overall doesn't exceed that cap, then we're not overfishing and it's sustainable.
But in practice, that led to the consolidation of the fishing industry. The catch quotas were allotted to fishermen based on how much of that fish they caught in recent past. So if a small-scale guy hadn't fished much cod, he got a meager quota, which basically cut him off from his source of income.
If they have a small quota for a particular fishery, it becomes often very challenging because these fisheries are often swimming together. So cod and haddock can be commingling, or cod and pollock can be commingling. And so if you have a low quota for cod and you accidentally catch it, even if you have a larger quota for other species, you are essentially done for the rest of the season.
For large companies, the catch share quota had the opposite effect. If a company owned 20 boats and had been landing hundreds of thousands of pounds of cod in the past 3 years, their quotas went sky high, in some cases giving the industrial fishing operations a near unlimited access to fish. And if they max out their quota, they can buy or lease more quotas from each other because they have enough money to pay for it. Meanwhile, large boat owners oftentimes don't even set foot on deck. They're third-party investors. They buy boats and gear and hire workers to cast the nets and process the catch.
So you're taking a public resource, which everyone has access to, and you're handing it to the people who have a history of catching certain species. So right then and there, they took a public resource away from the people, and they gave it to the boat owners.
They sold it to investors with a promise of a big return. I mean, they sold my fish, and they sold me out. And who are these people? I don't know who they are. I mean, do they go out and catch fish? Do they know anything about what I do? No, they actually don't. They've never been on the freaking deck of a boat. But yet they sold me out. How does that happen?
Part of that transition lent itself to those who could afford to buy these permits would consolidate all the access. And very quickly, that access consolidated into the hands of just a few players. One of the players, based out of New Bedford, was one of the largest fishing companies in the United States. Owned over 30 permits, 50 boats, and last year earned 25% of the total groundfish revenue for all of New England. One company, over 25% of the revenue. And that same company was just indicted by the IRS on 30 accounts of fraud, cheating, and misconduct for saying he was catching one thing, but really he was catching something else.
And this,
So it goes to prove that, you know, the belief that consolidating the industry will be good for regulation is completely false.
The problem was that, and the theory is that as long as the fleet overall is staying under that total catch, it doesn't really matter who catches it. And what we're saying is that it actually does matter, because what we've seen is, just like stocks traded on Wall Street, these quotas can be bought, sold, and traded, and inevitably will funnel and consolidate to those who have the most resources and are fishing at the largest scale, and to us who are essentially doing the largest ecological damage. So the quota system has really lent itself to a consolidation that has mimicked so much of the other consolidation we've seen in our economy that ultimately is undermining the health of the ocean, our coastal communities, our fishing communities, our family fishermen.
And meanwhile, it's the little family fishermen who are sometimes scrutinized to a ridiculous level, which escalates the anger and frustration at the crippled regulation system.
yesterday we got in about 11:15 in the morning. I had a job interview in New Bedford. So the truck, one Lotus, was going to be there at 11:30. I wanted to lay down. I was tired. I get up at 2 in the morning when I don't oversleep. And then, you know, so I was laying down and Jackie said the environmental police were on the pier. He pulls in and Jackie's out back and he tells Jackie he wants to see the picture. Did you tell him I was sleeping?
Yeah, they said we were laying too, and he's like, oh, I need to see the permit.
He wanted to see the paperwork for the boat. So then I was like, you know, well, you can't wait. He's going to be there all day anyways.
Yeah.
So he was, I think just the fact that I wasn't jumping up or something, but he never introduced himself. He said he did. He had an attitude, I had an attitude, so it didn't go well from there. And he was concerned that we had about 15 pounds of conchs. You'll see some out here. And he didn't, so he wanted to see our conch gauge, you know, the measuring tool for that. There's no standard, there's no issue of them. You have to make your own, you're on your own to have it. So he takes out this little tape measure from his keychain and he's trying to measure my conch gauge to see if it's legal. And I'm like, that's real professional. And I walked back in here and sat down. I'm like, this guy's a freaking idiot. So he knows I'm pissed. He doesn't like the fact that I'm disrespecting him or whatever. And something else happened. He was talking to Jack. I go back out, and what did he say? He's gonna confiscate the conchs until another truck can come down with a conch gauge.
Yeah.
He's talking 15 pounds of conch, like $1 a pound. He's confiscating them. And I'm like, keep the things. I don't care. You take them home, have them for supper. I don't need them. I don't want them. He goes, well, I'll tell you right now, if any of these are short, there's going to be a violation and you're going to be responsible. I'm like, you. So people are around, the tourists are around, and he's like, keep that up, you're going to get arrested. And I walked away. Get back in the boat. He's standing on the pier, and so then he takes the conchs. So I get back in the boat, I take the basket of conchs, I throw them up on the pier. He picks them up, brings them over to his pickup truck, and undoes the tailgate. And lays them out like a kid with toys. And he's putting a big one here and a little one, and he's like, I swear to God. So I'm like, this guy's a moron. So he gets them all laid out in his truck. They're baking in the sun, you know. And he comes back and he's standing on the pier, you know, just standing there. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should apologize. I said, you know what? I apologize. I'm tired. I got a lot going on. And he's like, it's too late for that.
Part of the bigger context of this regulation is that any fisherman is good with oversight to help with accountability for what's being pulled out of the ocean. No doubt about it. But what's happening is that because management can't figure out a way to do it effectively, oftentimes fishermen might have an observer coming out with them on a boat, counting the fish they pull in. When you get back to the dock, you have somebody who's observing there while you're offloading, counting that fish. And then on top of that, you have an environmental police officer will a third party come to count that same fish. And oftentimes, the value of this fish might be $15 or so. So that's very frustrating, that what feels like a very poor use of the public's money. And then also that level of oversight feels to the level of harassment.
It is harassment.
Yeah. And then
There was more money spent on that day, and that happened to me last year with the Coast Guard and the observer on the boat, the Coast Guard, I get in, the environmental police are there. It's like, how much money was spent today looking at one of the last dinosaurs?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, really? These people, there's so few of us, they're all going around. Yeah, like just watching us. Full-time fishermen, we plus 80% of the fishermen in New England, full-time fishermen. A lot of them have just left the industry. And the National Marine Fisheries Service is still hiring people. They built a brand new building in Gloucester 10 years ago because they were outgrowing the old one. They built a brand new building to put everybody in one office, and now they're leasing property all around Gloucester because they keep hiring people to regulate fishing. There's more money spent regulating us than we generate. How is that good for the consumer? How's that good? And then it's insane.
Yeah, I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, but it's definitely true that part of consolidation has been this dwindling of actual fishermen with boots on deck going out on the water. We've seen since 2010 the number of groundfish boats has been cut, by ×5. I think before 2010 there was about 1,000 active boats in the groundfish fishery, and now there's about 200. And so along with a reduction in the amount of people actually fishing, we've seen an increase in the amount of bureaucrats working to regulate the fisheries, an increase in oversight of the boats that are actually doing the fishing. And like Stephen said too, he's certainly not against regulation, but what we're seeing is not effective regulation.
No question about it, it's definitely a lack of good government. Government's being snowballed by these behind-the-scenes people telling them that, hey, this is the way it's got to be. They don't know what we do, and they're listening to other groups that have interest in what we do and being snowballed by them saying this is the route we have to go. So it's a lack of government and private interest groups taking over that have really put the hammer on commercial fishing. And they love labeling us as the enemy.
That set the stage for this idea that if we could turn that access into a private property, into a quota that could be bought, sold, and traded just like a stock on Wall Street, that if you owned it, you would take better care of it. And the ownership is the fish access. If you literally could own that fish access just like a private property, you take better care of it, just like a landlord is better suited to take care of their building than a tenant. But we're learning that in the big picture, in the housing crisis in particular, we learned that there was no incentive for the people who owned these buildings would necessarily do what was in the best interest of the public. And in fact, they did what was in their own best interest, which was maximizing profit. And we're seeing the same pattern replicated in the fisheries.
Ocean privatization is the most recent attempt to push the family fishermen out the game, but certainly not the first. The big fishing companies and distributors have been doing it for years, by way of free trade which allowed them to control the wholesale prices. Fishing is the second most dangerous profession in the United States, bested only by forestry when it comes to fatalities. Winches, cables, and other equipment snatch off people's limbs. Boats break, leak, burn, and sink. Between bad weather, bad catches, and bad equipment, fishermen face unexpected challenges all the time, no matter how prepared they are. Perseverance is second nature. One would think that in the free market they would at least be able to set prices for their hard labor. But the free market has become a buyer's market, controlled by the big distributors that act as middlemen. Traditionally, fishermen don't sell directly to consumer. They either sold to a distributor who bought their entire catch for a bulk off-the-boat price, who would then send a truck to unload the boat and drive the fish to a fish auction, for example to Boston or Portland, the capital of Maine. When fishermen ship their catch to the auction, they have no idea how much money they will get for it, and if they'll make a profit at all.
Waiting for the prices to come out on Monday morning after selling fish on Sunday was akin to waiting for the lottery numbers to come out to see if you got a winning ticket. If the prices are high, it's like, yeah. And if they're not so good, it's like, it's the difference between making a paycheck and making a good paycheck, making a not so good paycheck, or losing money.
Besides being unfair to the average fisherman, this method of fish distribution is also very environmentally unsound. According to a study by Lauren McClanachan, a professor of environmental studies at Colby College in Maine, conventionally harvested seafood in the United States travels an average distance of 5,475 miles. By contrast, when seafood is sold locally, similarly to the farm-to-table approach, it travels about 40 miles. These numbers don't include seafood sent to China for processing and then shipped back. So far, no researcher has published official data, but about 80 to 90% of all industrially caught fish in the United States and Canada is shipped to China for processing and then shipped back, despite the fact that it doesn't make any environmental or business sense. However, for economies of scale, this business model works. It favors large volume, low value, and low cost product. According to Niaz Dori of the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, or NAMA for short, the global market forces fishermen to either scale up or sell out. The global market is based on high volume, low value fishing operation that only honors large scale industrial fishing. The volume, not the value of fish that you bring to shore.
When we talk about scale, we also talk about the values that fishermen bring to their business. Are you an owner-operator? That's part of being a smaller scale fisherman. Is it independently owned? Or are you, hired by somebody else? What level of volume are you catching is also part of small and medium scale fisheries. So one very simple way to maybe define the industrial scale is a very bottom line, economic profit is the bottom line, catching high volume at low value. That is the formula for the industrial scale fisheries.
Besides the scale issue, there's also fishing gear. There are different types of commercial fishing gear with varied environmental footprint. Some types of gear are arguably more sustainable than others. Trawlers that cast big nets can't differentiate what that net pulls up. They usually produce a lot of bycatch, fish that are too small to catch, species that aren't allowed to be caught, fish that we don't like to eat, which are then tossed back into the sea. Electric reels, which work similarly to hook and line reels, except they're more robust and operate continuously, are arguably more sustainable. Most fish they hook up ends in the fisherman's cooler, and only some bycatch gets thrown back. The most discerning fishermen fish with rods and reels, the old-fashioned way, by hand.
I've fished my whole life, and I loved fishing since I was a kid. Everyone asked me how I got started fishing, and it actually, my mother says it was the biggest mistake of her life. She used to take me out of school for a doctor's appointment and bring me half-day mackerel fishing on the party boat. And ever since then, I was hooked on fishing. So I was that kid that always asked for, passes to go, fishing on the boats for Christmas. And then that passion stayed with me, and I, worked in different parts of the industry. I've worked on the big commercial boats. I've worked lobstering. I've worked party charter. And when I worked on the bigger boats, kind of saw what went on as far as destruction and all that. And it did eat at my conscience doing it because I grew up around reel fishing and basically kind of took a step back and said, sometimes what are we leaving for the next generation on the path that we're going on right now? And then I started doing this about 7 years ago. We've got the first boat, and then the second boat we upgraded, and now to this boat. Every boat I say it's my last boat, but it turns into another boat, typical of fishermen. And I love doing it, very passionate about what I do. So I believe it's better for the resource, and if you actually go back to how fishing started in New England. It started with the dorymen and people fishing with hand lines and tub trawls and things of that sort. And we're kind of a throwback to that era. Granted, our technology is a little further along in fishing tackle wise, but it's still done by hand. We're not allowed electric reels or anything like that. So when we catch 2,200 pounds of fish, that's 2,200 pounds gutted and gilled. We've done it with our bare hands. And it's doable. We do it on a regular basis. So there's only so much damage you can do with your bare hands and a fishing pole compared to a 90-foot dragger with a huge net. Somehow that kind of falls on deaf ears.
One thing to point out that's important is that when we talk about gear type, it's important to acknowledge that no gear type has a halo over its head, that each gear type has its own issues and problems. When it comes to longline fishing, it's very difficult to avoid the smaller and juvenile fish. When it comes to the gill net fishery, it's very difficult to avoid the mammals. And then when it comes to the dragger trawl net fishery, they interact with the bottom. So at any given scale, each of those gear types can do significant damage. We've seen it with all of the gear types. And then vice versa. At a lower scale, appropriate to the ecosystem, each of those gear types can do very minimal damage.
The same gear can be used in a more sustainable or less sustainable way, depending on the scale of operation and, well, human greed. If the trawler drags the net for less than 40 minutes, most of that bycatch makes it back into the water while it's still alive. If the trawler waits longer and brings up nets that are too full, the bycatch gets squished and deprived of oxygen too much to recover and is basically killed for nothing. Pulling up the net is hard work. For the unconscientious fisherman, waiting for the net to full is easier, it's less work and more product. Smaller boats that go out to sea for a day as opposed to several days bring back less fish but of better quality because it's not piled up in their holds, squished and beaten up into mush by thousands of pounds of its own weight. It's gutted and bled right there on the boat and kept in small coolers, yielding a better quality fish. But there are no mechanisms that reward conscientious fishermen, whether they use nets, reels, or their hands. When their fish ends up on the auction, whether sustainably caught, day caught, or hand caught, it sells for the same bottom line price as fish from a huge trawler, or a trip boat as they're called. What's more, a distributor can buy fish from anyone and label it hand caught, and no one checks.
Our fish is high quality, but when you go to an auction and you put your beautiful, colorful fish on the auction floor, and then you have 20,000 pounds of fish from a trip boat that are really beat up, not that, it's apples and oranges, but in the same sense, the buyers have told me that your fish are beautiful, they're awesome, but it doesn't matter because we can just buy this cheap stuff and label it day caught, label it hook caught. I don't know how many restaurants I've been out to eat and it says hook caught, day caught fish on the menu. And I want to go like, it's funny, where did you get that hook caught, day caught fish? Because the last time I checked, I'm the only guy doing it.
So if the regulations are against you and the free market is against you and your middlemen don't appreciate your good product, all of which means that the system has failed you, what do? Do you quit, as many have already done? Or do you fight back, as some have tried and failed? The answer is, you do neither. You create your own market.
I'm Stephanie Villani of Blue Moon Fish, and my husband Alex and I sell fish at the green markets in New York City. We've been here for 28 years, and this year will be my 20th year at the Union Square Green Market. Alex has a boat called the Blue Moon in Mattituck, Long Island. It's about 100 miles from the city, and we sell mostly fish we catch from his boat and a few other local items that we're allowed to sell through the Green Markets program. You're allowed to bring in 25% of your catch can be other local fish. Like for example, we bring in tuna. Alex doesn't go out to catch the tuna anymore. So we're allowed to buy it from local fishermen. But it's all regulated and checked by the Green Market. We bring in sea scallops. We don't catch those ourselves, but it is local.
By going directly to the market, bypassing the middlemen, the Villanis are able to set the price to be what they want.
I can tell you the other local fishermen in our area, they go out fishing every day. They come home, the fish goes in a box. A truck comes around to the dock, picks it up, and takes it to the fish market, the Hunts Point market in the city, and then They get whatever price they get, and a few days later they get a check in the mail. And they get a very low price. They, like, for example, porgies are like $1 now. They were 40 cents. They're like $1 now. So you have to catch a lot of porgies to make any money, but you're limited on what you can catch. It's only a certain amount you can catch. But by going to the green market, what we do, I can set the price for the porgies. We sell them for $3.95 a pound, which is a good price for the customer. It's a really good price for the fishermen. So, we're happy, the customer's happy. It is a little more work to get it there for sure, but it works for us.
Stephanie and her husband are part of a bigger movement that started in 2007 by a group of Maine fishermen who were fed up with the low prices they were being paid for their catch. The idea was to try an approach similar to community-supported agriculture. People support the farm-to-table approach, so why couldn't fishermen try a boat-to-fork approach?
They were having meetings in Portland at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and we decided to go down there since we were well organized now. They had brought in a farmer and he was talking about CSAs. The idea was that, hey, how come fishermen don't do this and start a CSF? It was my wife and I, my brother and his wife, and we said, hey, we could do that. We started out with shrimp shares, and we basically copied the farm model where we would ask people for $100 or $200, and they would get 10 pounds or 5 pounds or whatever it was for a set number of weeks, and we started delivering to a church up in Rockland. One of the ladies at the church helped us organize and got all the congregation to sign up, or some of them, and we'd drive up to the church every Sunday with 150 pounds of shrimp or whatever in the wintertime and hand out the shares. And in contrast, that winter, there were about 6 of us that landed over 1 million pounds of shrimp. So 150 pounds a week really didn't look like too much, but it was a start. And then it grew into, okay, what are we gonna do now? And said, well, we'll just keep going with fish. And of course, everybody said, that'll never work. People don't want whole fish, they want fish fillets. And no one will buy whole fish. And we went from about 30 shares with shrimp that winter to around 300 handing out whole fish shares. And the word spread to, I guess it was basically a network of churches that got it started. And a lot of the people that were in the church congregations would sign up and they would tell their friends. And some of them were members of the Belfast Co-op in Belfast, and they were big supporters. And that was really our biggest drop-off point. We had close to 50 people right there, and we'd drive up there once a week and hand out a bag of, here's your codfish, or here's your flounder, or whatever.
Since 2007, the community-supported fishery, or CSF movement, literally exploded. Started by Joshua Stoll, the website localcatch.org now counts almost 300 community-supported fisheries in the United States and Canada. The site helps fishermen exchange ideas and experiences and helps consumers find who to buy locally caught seafood from. The big question, however, is whether these local communities can bring enough buyers for fishermen to make a living. And if not, how can they grow their business without scaling up to the unsustainable levels of big factory ships? In 2006, NAMA began an investigation. How could small-scale fishermen get a leg up in the global market and achieve both economic sustainability and financial success? They concluded that fishermen had to forget the global market and focus on creating their own niche markets. But niche fish markets need big local clients, and that was the strategy that NAMA pioneered. To help fishermen create sustainable niche markets, NAMA turned to large institutions, hospitals, and universities, asking them to buy their seafood from local suppliers. To recruit these large buyers, NAMA teamed up with some institutional allies, such as Healthcare Without Harm, the National Farm to Cafeteria Conference, and Real Food Challenge. Many institutions were already sourcing from local farmers, and that was a big help. Now NAMA is working to expand the program beyond New England. According to NIAS, the healthcare sector and Healthcare Without Harm work to educate their purchasing departments who are in charge of these services and are already buying from local farmers, buying produce in season, and paying attention to how farmers are being paid to apply these same principles to fishermen. The hope is to shift purchasing power towards small and medium-scale operations instead of commodity markets. In the healthcare industry in North America, nursing homes, hospitals, and clinics spend roughly $12 billion on food, and we're guesstimating roughly a quarter of it is spent on seafood. And we are beginning to see a little by little shift towards small community-supported fishing. That's not only important to fishing industries, but it's also important for policymaking. Because when we go in front of policymakers, going back to supply and demand, now the suppliers are coming to the table and saying we want a different policy. They start pushing policies that can shift markets. Community-supported fisheries are also doing another very important thing. They're educating consumers about what other seafood they can eat. We're used to cooking just a few species, but there are plenty of other fish in the sea. It's just that historically we never fished them or decided that we didn't like them because we didn't know how to cook them. By partnering with professional chefs, NAMA and CSFs are able to teach consumers how to cook these abundant species, which takes the pressure off the endangered ones.
My father fished his whole career, my grandfather fished, my uncles, my brother fishes, and the anger of mismanagement, the anger of poor policy, the anger of harassment from those who do oversee fish is something that's always been around for as long as I can remember. Sitting around the dinner table at the family barbecue, what I experienced most from the men in my family was anger and frustration, an inability to have an outlet to make change, feeling like things are very hopeless, feeling that nobody in the public really cared, no one in the public could really understand. And for a lot of fishermen like Stephen, he was saying that when the groundfish stocks were low in the late 90s and early 2000s, the government was telling fishermen like him to take it easy on the fish, back off, try and diversify your fishery, go try and catch something else. We need you to do that, to take some pressure off of the stock. And a lot of fishermen like Stephen did. And so his historical catch during that window was actually very low. And then he was penalized when they did the formula to allocate the quota. So his permit wasn't really worth very much at all. We did a lot of organizing work over the past 4 years to address the transition to catch shares. We knew that consolidation was a problem, family fishermen being displaced was a problem, the lack of access and affordability was a problem, so we brought all that to our decision makers. When we first started, it was mostly fishermen. We had a lot of fishermen coming expressing the same problem. Through our work with the markets, with community-supported fisheries, with the institutions, those folks started to care about where the fish was coming from. They started to hear the stories from the fishermen, and then they started to realize that fishermen needed support on the policy level. So we started having hospital advocates, community-supported fishery advocates come into these policy meetings to be there as a supportive voice and ally for the family fishermen. That started agitating our policymakers. They prioritized some of these, what we were calling safeguards, to protect family fishermen in these catch share programs.
But the big guys weren't going to give up their privileges.
One of the largest fleet owners in New England committed publicly to fight our work with $10 million. He said, if these safeguards pass, I will sue the government, I will sue this body, I will spend $10 million on day one to fight this work. That's the kind of resistance that we were facing. This fleet owner had, at the time, about 30 boats and over 50 fishing permits. In addition to owning the fleet, he also owned and controlled levels of fish processing and fish distribution. So as we were facing that level of resistance, we were bringing more people to the table until ultimately what happened was the policy-making body that we call the New England Fisheries Management Council. They decide regulations in conjunction with NOAA Fisheries. They had reacted so strongly that they had publicly done things like turn off of our mics. They would silence us. They completely violated aspects of the public process in order to not address the message that we were bringing. So part of what we demonstrated was this flaw in public process to oversee fisheries management.
One reason why it's hard for the fishermen to be heard is the very nature of their job. It's being on the boat, away from land for hours or days at a time, living on a weird schedule incongruent with the normal 9 to 5 or so schedule with the rest of us.
This issue of, for the fishermen's regular daily routine, they're getting up at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, fishing all day long, on the sea, on a rocking boat, and then you get back, you offload around 4 or 5 o'clock, you've hardly slept, you've hardly ate. And for a lot of fishermen, when they get back, those are the moments when they might have a policy meeting or a decision-making meeting is happening, taking place, and the ability to go into those spaces and actually be an effective advocate for yourself is incredibly challenging. So this issue of a policy-making process that is not adapting to the lifestyle and the experience of a fisherman. This past year, we brought fishermen together from around New England to a policy meeting. We had the hospitals, we had the markets, we had local businesses all come to testify at once to tell publicly to this decision-making body that what they were doing was wrong and that we were walking away from this process because it's essentially failed family fishermen. And so the next step for us to have accountability over this decision-making process is ultimately to go to the Department of Congress. So that's the next step for us. That meeting, when we walked out, one of the fishermen, an old timer who's been doing this for a very long time, he told me, Brett, walking out of this meeting, we may not have got what we want, but seeing all these people, seeing young people in here, seeing local business people in here, for me, for the first time, actually gives me hope that we can make change. So that meant a lot to me, and I think kind of paints a picture of, no doubt about it, it's an uphill battle, but we're doing a much better job at telling the story to the public, bringing in new waves of energy to pay attention to what's happening to our family fishermen. For us, that's the only way that we can do it. We have to get organized, we have to build a stronger base of power, we have to channel our message to our policymakers.
I have a son, and if he wants to be a fisherman, I want to allot him the opportunity to be a fisherman. There is no way I am going to let it continue the way it is, and then there is no opportunity for him to be a fisherman. There are families here that are generations of fishermen. That's what they want to do and continue on doing. It's a pride factor too. But with the route we're going and the rate we're going, we're driving into the ground and we have no say over it. It's got to change. And I see the movement and I see everything that people have just had enough. My son's 3 and his name's Noah. Yep, that's the name of this boat. Yep.
I'm pretty sympathetic towards the party charter industry because that was my opportunity to go fishing as a kid. And I have a 4-year-old son. And that opportunity is being taken away from families right now too. They're not letting, these businesses are going out quicker than anyone's. And take a step back and say, hey, I was that kid that was 8 years old. The people that aren't represented here are the families that were just going to go fishing and experience a day on the fishing that don't own a 36-foot boat. And that opportunity is not going to be there for them soon if it stays like that. These guys are going out of business like no tomorrow. It's kind of like a right to bear arms issue for me. To right to bear a fishing pole. And so that's what's going on in New England. And to make a long story short, it's a system of management we're on. It's created basically this sector system has a lot of people that are making money fishing by not going fishing. And it's kind of, to me, it's a simple approach. If you want to make money fishing, go fishing. You shouldn't be able to sit home and collect a check for not going fishing.
I got into fishing when I was about 16. One of my neighbors was a lobsterman and just was looking for a summer job. I was helping the lobsterman during the summer, and then actually that's how I got into it, knew I liked it. And then years later I was looking for a job and I found a guy who had a boat, and I was working on it and he ended up, it didn't work, but luckily someone else at the dock had seen me working on the boat every day and coming there and doing, all the jobs. And he said, hey, good worker right there, I'll take him out. So it ended up working out that somebody just saw me in my hard work, so got lucky, I guess.
5 years ago, Jack was the only guy on the dock who was under 30. Not that there's many young fishermen today, but now there's 2 more, and it's a start.
Say 5 years ago or 10 years ago, there was that big push to go to college and everything. And I think kids are seeing now that college isn't the only option, and having getting out of college with the crippling debt, and then not having a job in the industry went to school for is just silly. So why not get a decent paying job right out of high school that you can get with, you know, basically a GED, and then you can work and learn while you're working and get to where you want to go, you know. You can have your own goals. I mean, if you look up and down the dock, I'm probably one of maybe 20 fishermen, and out of those 20, maybe 3, 4 other young people, under 30, I'm saying, you know what I mean? When I was 21, I was the only one. There was nobody.
It's a long road from the dock help to being able to own and operate a boat, but Jack's walking it slowly. To him, fishing is special. It makes him feel happy. It makes him feel successful. It makes him feel like he's hunting for treasures, and he finds them every time he pulls up the net.
Trying to get the money together for a boat is tough, but for bank loans and all that stuff, you're gonna probably need to take some classes on, you know, learning how to fix engines is a definite. A few captain's classes. I have got my operator's permit, so I'm going slowly towards it, taking baby steps. Just as Steve said, it's kind of funny when he was talking about that. I loved playing out in the woods. I was always flipping over logs, looking for, you know, salamanders, bugs, or whatever. And, you know, it just seems like almost like it. You're pulling up a net, and you don't know what's going to be in it every time. So I feel like a kid again whenever I do it. Every day is different, like how it's... you know, every day being different. Stuff like that, just, you know, getting to goof around with your boss. Who gets to do that every day, you know? I like that. It sounds crazy, but I do.
It's people like Steve, like Doug, Tim, and certainly young people like Jack who NAMA are fighting for. And it takes people like Brett to do the fighting, to keep the tradition, to continue being small-scale fishermen for the access to fish, and also the right to be heard.
There's something bigger that's happening right now, and that's this fight over what we're calling ocean grabbing. That we're in this moment in history right now where this new, what they're calling the blue revolution, and that's creating these new investment opportunities into ocean access, which fisheries are part of, but that also means energy, like oil and gas drilling. It means aquaculture. It means transportation. And up until this point, the ocean's been relatively, what's the word? I don't want to say unmanaged, but unplanned. How about that? It's been relatively unplanned. And we're in this moment right now where on a global level, and a lot of this planning work is being driven by the likes of the World Bank, who see the opportunity to do ocean planning as a means for new investment in, you know, transportation and energy and food systems, aquaculture. And when it comes to the ability for fishermen to really have a say in some of these processes, they feel voiceless.
The concept of greed is good was once used to show how bad a person can be, but somehow it has been turned around into a good thing. It's not. Resources are not infinite. We've seen the collapse of real estate markets, mortgage markets, and wholesale gutting of industries. The problem is the ocean is bigger than the stock market and real estate. We can't let the ocean collapse, because if we do and the oceans die, we die.
I guess for me personally, I do have to have hope. I have no other choice. I do this work out of gratitude and appreciation, really, because for me, coming from a fishing family, the ocean and the ability to make a living from the ocean and feed people from the ocean has given me all the opportunities that I've had. It's provided for my family, it's provided for my education, and out of that gratitude is why I'm fighting for a better ocean, fighting for better opportunity for family fishermen. And yeah, it's an uphill battle, just like any of the issues that we've compared it to. For the family farmer, it's been an uphill battle. For affordable housing, it's always been a battle. For affordable healthcare access, it's a battle. But it's a battle that I care about. And I have to maintain the hope. I have to believe that we can have a better future, and that I can hopefully pass on the same kind of values and ethics and stewardship that my father and my grandfather passed on to me.